My name is Ethan. I was an architect, a man of logic until this house. This beautiful, decaying relic, nestled deep in the Appalachians, promised a fresh start, a legacy reborn. Instead, it delivered an unspeakable truth, written in the dust of generations and etched into the very foundations. I came to restore, to rebuild, but it was my reality that crumbled, piece by agonizing piece. Now all that remains is a whisper of what I once was, trapped between these ancient walls, counting the minutes until the sun sets again. You won't believe what these mountains hide. The gravel road had long dissolved into a barely there dirt track, a faint scar winding deeper and deeper into the dense ancient Appalachian forest. Each turn of my truck's tires seemed to chew away at the last vestiges of cell signal, of civilization, of everything familiar. The air grew cooler, thicker, carrying the scent of pine needles, damp earth, and something indefinably old, a primal aroma of deep woods. Ahead, perched on a slight rise, stood the house. Not just a house, but the house. My great-great-uncle's house, an unexpected and frankly baffling inheritance from a man I'd never met, whose existence had been little more than a whisper in fragmented family anecdotes. It was a sprawling two-story timber frame structure, its gabled roofline sharp against the late afternoon sky, sagged slightly in places, but retained an undeniable, almost defiant grandeur. It was a testament to endurance, a relic stubbornly clinging to its place in the wilderness. Overgrown with tenacious ivy that had begun to creep beneath the eaves, its porch railings splintered like old bones, windows dark and opaque with grime. It was a beautiful, decaying ruin, a challenge. For me, Ethan, an architect, meticulous and pragmatic, with a deep reverence for history and the inherent honesty of good structure, this was it. My passion project. My escape from the sterile perfection of city life. My chance to reconnect with a family lineage I knew almost nothing about. I saw not decay but potential, not ruin but a story waiting to be rebuilt. My life until this point had been a well-ordered progression. Top of my class, demanding internships, a rapid ascent through a prestigious firm, specializing in sleek, modern designs and urban revitalization. I thrived on order, on measurable progress, on the predictable logic of physics and engineering. This house, however, was different. This was raw, untamed history, a challenge that hummed in my veins, promising to test every one of my skills. My plan was, as always, methodical. First, a comprehensive structural assessment, then meticulously cataloging every existing feature, every piece of salvaged furniture or personal effect. I aimed to plan the restoration with painstaking detail, respecting every original nail and beam where possible, infusing new life while preserving the ghost of the past. I had brought my professional-grade tools, my precision surveying equipment, my high-resolution camera, and a state-of-the-art audio recorder to document every single step. This was my domain, and here, in this remote corner of the world, I was utterly and completely in control, or so I believed. The first few days dissolved into a blur of organized, productive chaos. The air inside was surprisingly still, thick with the scent of aged wood, damp earth, and something else. Something faintly metallic, like old coins, left too long in a forgotten drawer, or perhaps the tang of undisturbed mineral deposits from deep within the earth itself. Dust motes danced in the sparse, anemic slivers of sunlight that pierced the grimy windows, illuminating centuries of accumulated debris. Each discovery felt like uncovering an archaeological artifact, a rusted sewing machine, a stack of worn, leather-bound books whose titles were too faded to read, a tarnished silver locket containing a blurred, faded daguerreotype of stern-faced ancestors whose eyes, even in sepia, seemed to follow my movements with an unsettling intensity. I photographed everything from multiple angles, meticulously recorded my observations into my digital logs, and filed them neatly into folders on my robust, off-grid laptop. The silence of the mountains was profound, a vast, echoing quiet, broken only by the chirping of unseen crickets, the rustle of leaves in the gentle breeze, and the rhythmic hum of my power tools. It was a productive, albeit isolated, solitude, a meditative state I'd craved in the city's incessant clamor. One afternoon, while systematically clearing out a cluttered workbench in what I assumed was once a utility room, a space choked with paint cans, brittle brushes, and ancient, petrified rags, my gloved hand brushed against something heavy and cold, tucked beneath a pile of old curled canvases. It was a wooden toolbox, surprisingly well preserved, despite its age. The wood was dark, almost mahogany, smoothed by countless hands, its brass latches oxidized to a dull green. Inside, nestled among tarnished wrenches, petrified paintbrushes, and desiccated tubes of oil paint, lay a small leather-bound notebook. Its cover was dark, almost black with age, the leather worn smooth in places, revealing lighter, fawn-colored patches beneath. There was no title on the spine, no inscription on the front, just the cool, almost slick feel of ancient leather beneath my fingertips. My heart gave a little professional flutter. An old diary, a family ledger. This was precisely the kind of intimate historical treasure I'd hoped to unearth, a direct link to the enigmatic ancestors who built and lived in these walls. I carefully, almost reverently, opened it. The pages, yellowed and brittle at the edges, were filled with tight, spidery handwriting in faded sepia ink. It wasn't a diary in the traditional sense, nor a ledger. It was a list of rules. Numbered, precise, and, as I quickly discovered, utterly bizarre. I pulled out my phone, its screen a jarringly modern glow in the dim light, and began snapping photos, a sardonic, almost indulgent smile playing on my lips. My great-great-uncle, a man I'd heard was a lifelong recluse, certainly had a quirky sense of humor, perhaps even a touch of mountain madness. This would be a fantastic anecdote for dinner parties back in the city. I started to read, initially with an amused indulgence, a detached academic curiosity, but as my eyes scanned further down the list, a faint, almost imperceptible prickle of unease began to replace my initial amusement. Work ceases when the last light of the sun leaves the mountain peak. No exceptions. Okay, I mused, scanning the faded script. Simple enough. A rule for avoiding working in the dark, perhaps a practical warning about navigating the treacherous forest paths after dusk. Or maybe an old farmer's superstition about preserving eyesight by not straining it in poor light, sensible in a rustic, pre-electricity sort of way. I mentally chuckled, considering I had a powerful gasoline-fueled generator purring outside and an array of high-lumen worklights designed to turn night into day. A charming anachronism, nothing more. The attic window, north-facing, must always remain slightly ajar, neither fully open nor completely closed. This one was odder. Ventilation, maybe. To let out stagnant air, or to let something in, or out. I imagined some old-timer worried about damp, or perhaps a more esoteric concern about trapped spirits. I made a mental note to check the window later, to make sure it was secure, but probably just a drafty old house. Still, the precise instruction, neither fully open nor completely closed, struck me as remarkably specific for something so seemingly trivial. If a melody is heard from within the walls, accompany it with a low whistle. Never attempt to find its source. My brow furrowed deeper. Melodies from the walls. This was pure Appalachian folklore, straight out of a campfire story. Ghost stories for the grandkids, perhaps a way to keep them occupied on long winter nights. I could almost hear my great-great-uncle cackling as he penned this one down, imagining the reaction. Still, the specificity of the low whistle and the stark imperative never attempt to find its source was intriguing. It felt less like a tale and more like an instruction. Bring no metal tools into the house that have not belonged to the family. Now this was getting interesting. My modern power drill, my precision laser level, my titanium-headed hammer, all strictly verboten by this ancient decree. Was it about respecting tradition, preserving the integrity of the original construction? Or was there some strange, archaic belief about foreign metals disrupting a natural energy field? I dismissed it as charmingly quaint, a relic of a bygone era. My expensive, brand-new tools weren't going anywhere. This house needed modern care, not just antiquated reverence. If a personal object of yours disappears, do not seek it out. Consider it a payment. This one sent a distinct cold shiver down my spine, despite myself. A payment? To whom? For what? This sounded less like a harmless superstition and more like an obligation, a transaction. The word payment hung in the air, heavy and unsettling. I tried to shake off the growing unease, telling myself it was just a list, an old man's eccentricities amplified by my own imagination in this profound silence. Nothing more. My logical mind searched for a benign explanation, perhaps a metaphor for loss or a practical reminder against clutter. I took more photos of the pages, zooming in on the faded ink, capturing every curve and flourish of the script. The idea of these rules, possibly passed down through generations, was a fascinating historical quirk, a glimpse into the isolated worldview of my ancestors. I definitely used them as a talking point when I eventually reopened the house to potential buyers, or more likely, a historical society. But even as I catalogued them, the feeling of isolation, which had initially been a comforting balm, now started to feel a little heavier, a little more present. The sheer expansive silence of the forest outside the thick walls, the way the ancient timbers absorbed all sound, seemed to leave a peculiar emptiness, a void in the air. My technology, usually a source of comfort and control, felt strangely out of place here, almost anemic. My camera battery seemed to drain faster than usual, even after a full charge, struggling to hold power in the dry, cold air. My portable radio, meant to keep me company and provide some semblance of the outside world, only crackled with persistent static. And sometimes, in the deepest quiet, that static seemed to coalesce into faint rhythmic patterns, like a distant, distorted pulse just beyond the threshold of recognition. The work lights I'd painstakingly hooked up, powered by my faithful generator outside, flickered occasionally, not with a sudden surge, but a slow, deliberate dimming and brightening, as if the house itself were drawing a breath, or perhaps acknowledging my presence. These were old house quirks, I told myself stubbornly. Just faulty wiring, old circuits, atmospheric interference. Nothing sinister, just old and tired, like me. I resumed my work, focusing on stripping away layers of old peeling wallpaper in the grand living room, finally revealing the beautiful, solid oak paneling beneath. The satisfaction of revealing the house's original bones, of bringing its true character back to light, was immense. I lost myself in the rhythm of the work. The satisfying scrape of my wallpaper remover, the gratifying peel of the aged paper, the steady, comforting hum of my portable sander as I smoothed a particularly stubborn section of a ceiling beam, prepping it for a fresh coat of sealant. It was meditative, almost hypnotic. The afternoon light, which had been streaming brightly through the recently cleaned, though still somewhat hazy, west-facing windows, began its inevitable fade. I glanced at my watch, then up at the darkening glass. The sun was dipping, a molten orb of fiery orange and deep purple, just below the ridge of the distant mountains. A magnificent view, really, painting the sky in a breathtaking tableau of twilight. I smiled, then the smile faltered as a sudden realization hit me. The last sliver of sunlight had just vanished from the highest peak. I had, by my great-great-uncle's first rule, gone past my allowed working hours. "Well, old man," I muttered to the empty room, a hint of defiance, perhaps even a touch of nervous bravado in my voice. "Some rules, I suppose, are meant to be broken." I kept sanding, telling myself I only had another few minutes, just a small section. The hum of the sander was a familiar comfort, a modern counterpoint to the ancient silence, a sound of progress. Then it died. Not with a sputtering cough, not with a whine of protest, but with an abrupt, total cessation. One moment, the rhythmic, vibrating drone filled the room, the next absolute, profound silence. My hand, still gripping the inert tool, felt suddenly heavy, useless. The silence was so complete, so sudden, it was as if the air itself had been sucked out of the room. I blinked, frowning, trying to process the sudden void. The generator must have run out of gas, or a circuit breaker tripped. No big deal. Just an old machine or a temporary overload. Easy fix. But as the hum of the sander faded entirely, something else became acutely apparent. The profound silence that followed wasn't just the absence of sound, it was an active presence. A heavy, suffocating blanket had descended over the house, muffling even the distant chirping of the crickets. the rustle of leaves that had been my only companions. The air grew still, cold, prickling my skin with an invisible chill. Then from directly below me, from the locked basement that I hadn't yet been able to fully access, a single, clear, horrifying sound cut through the oppressive stillness. Scraapi. It was a heavy, metallic drag, the unmistakable sound of a massive, weighty chain, not rattling or clinking, but being deliberately pulled across a rough, unyielding stone floor. The sound spoke of immense weight, of purposeful, agonizingly slow movement. Each inch it traveled seemed to scrape at the very foundations of my composure. My breath hitched in my throat. My heart began to pound a frantic, desperate rhythm against my ribs, echoing in my ears. I stood frozen, sander still clutched in my hand, staring at the floorboard separating me from that impossible sound. The basement door was not just locked, it was bolted from the outside with a heavy iron bar and covered with 2 centuries of accumulated cobwebs and dust. Nothing could be down there. Nothing should be down there. My own investigation had confirmed it was empty. The silence that followed was even worse than the sound. It stretched, taut and agonizing, for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only a few agonizing seconds. My mind, usually a fortress of logic and reason, of observable facts and predictable outcomes, reeled. A generator fault, a dying battery, those were rational explanations for my tools. But a heavy chain, dragging itself across a locked, uninhabited basement floor, just moments after I'd broken the first, most fundamental rule of this strange house, that was not rational, that was not comprehensible. That violated every single principle I held dear. My logic had failed, and with it something inside me had begun to crack. That night was the first time I locked my bedroom door, pushing an old wardrobe in front of it for good measure. I didn't know it then, but it was already too late. If you want to find out what happens when the other rules are tested, subscribe and hit the notification bell to follow this restoration. Sleep did not come that night. It remained a distant shore, unreachable from the churning sea of my anxiety. I lay fully clothed on top of the musty bed covers, the heavy wardrobe I'd dragged in front of the door, a pathetic monument to my fear. Every creak of the ancient timber, every rustle of leaves outside, every sigh of the wind through a loose window frame was magnified 1,000 times in the suffocating silence. My mind, a frantic engine of logic, tried desperately to impose order on the chaos of the evening. The sound from the basement, the dragging chain. It had to be an animal, I told myself, a raccoon or a porcupine that had found a way in, its claws scraping against a forgotten piece of metal piping, the power tools dying. A simple coincidental overload on the aging generator. It was all explainable. It had to be. To believe otherwise was to step off a cliff into madness. Yet beneath the frantic rationalizations, a cold, hard knot of terror remained, a primal certainty that what I had heard was not animal, not coincidence, but a direct and immediate response to my transgression. A consequence. When the first pale grey fingers of dawn finally crept through the grimy window panes, it felt like a pardon. The oppressive weight of the night lifted, and with the light came a fragile, tentative return to sanity. I unbarricaded the door, my movements stiff and cautious, and descended the grand, creaking staircase. The house looked exactly as I had left it, a dusty, silent shell, a project waiting for my attention. The basement door remained bolted, its surface thick with undisturbed dust and cobwebs. There was no sign of disturbance, no evidence. My mind clung to this lack of physical proof like a drowning man to a raft. It was my imagination. Isolation, exhaustion, the power of suggestion from that old notebook. That had to be it. I spent the morning in a flurry of determinedly normal activity. I fired up the generator. It started on the first pull, purring contentedly. I brewed coffee on my portable stove, the rich aroma a welcome and grounding scent. I cleaned a set of windows, letting bright, clear sunlight flood the living room, chasing the deepest shadows from the corners. I was an architect, a man of science and reason. I would not be undone by the creaks of an old house and the folklore of a dead relative. But the notebook, the list of rules, sat on my workbench, its dark leather cover seeming to absorb the new light. A silent, mocking presence. It was a splinter in my mind, an unsolved variable in an equation I needed to balance. And that was when the idea, born of equal parts scientific pride and creeping dread, took hold. I had to know. I couldn't live in this house, work in this house, with this uncertainty hanging over me. I needed to disprove it, to create a controlled experiment and demonstrate once and for all that the rules were nothing more than the ramblings of a superstitious old man. I would test one, not a dangerous one, not one that involved strange melodies or leaving windows open to the elements. I would test rule number 5. If a personal object of yours disappears, do not seek it out. Consider it a payment. It was the perfect variable, simple, observable, and with a clear set of instructions to either follow or violate. My eyes fell upon my wrist. Ticking away faithfully was my father's watch. It was a 1960s Omega Seamaster, a classic elegant timepiece with a simple silver face and a worn leather strap. He had given it to me when I graduated from college, a few months before the cancer took him. It wasn't particularly valuable in a monetary sense, but its sentimental worth was immeasurable. It was a tangible link to him, a constant, quiet reminder of his belief in me. It was my most cherished personal object. It was perfect for the test. The stakes had to be real for the experiment to be valid. With a deep breath, I unstrapped it. The leather was warm from my skin. I carried it into the center of the main hall, a large open space with a high ceiling from which a dusty chandelier hung like a skeletal spider. I placed the watch carefully on a small round mahogany table that stood alone in the middle of the room. The sunlight from the newly cleaned windows gleamed on its polished crystal face. I took out my phone, documenting the scene with a series of photographs from every angle. I recorded a short video narrating my intent. "It is 11:17 a.m., I said, my voice sounding hollow and strange in the cavernous space. I am placing my father's watch on this table. I am going to work outside for the next 4 hours. The house is secure. All doors and windows are closed. Let's see what happens." The next 4 hours were the longest of my life. I busied myself with an exterior project, clearing the dangerously overgrown vines from the main chimney. But my mind was inside, focused on that small silver circle on the mahogany table. Every snap of a twig in the forest, every gust of wind, sent my head jerking back towards the house. I was a scientist observing his experiment, but I felt more like a fool tempting a fate I did not understand. At precisely 3:17 p.m., I put down my tools, my heart hammering against my ribs. I walked back to the house, my boots crunching on the gravel path. I pushed open the heavy oak door and stepped inside. The hall was silent, filled with the lazy afternoon light. I looked at the table. It was empty. A wave of cold dread washed over me, so intense it made my knees feel weak. It was gone. I walked slowly towards the table, my footsteps echoing in the silence. There was no sign of it, no scuff marks, no footprints in the dust on the floor around the table. It had simply vanished. My first instinct, a raw, primal surge of panic and loss, was to search, to scream, to tear the house apart until I found it. But the rule, the second part of the rule, echoed in my mind. Do not seek it out. For a moment, I considered obeying. I thought about the sound in the basement. Maybe this was the payment. Maybe if I just accepted the loss, that would be the end of it. But then, a different emotion surged through me, hot and powerful. Anger, an indignant rage. I was not some peasant in a fairy tale, leaving offerings for the sprites in the woods. I was Ethan Cole, a rational man in the 21st century. This was my house, my property, and my father's watch was in it. To hell with the rules. I began to search. At first, my search was as methodical as my architectural surveys. I started with the table itself, examining its surface, the floor beneath it, the surrounding area, spiraling outwards. Nothing. I checked the entire main hall, my professional calm slowly fraying at the edges. I moved into the adjoining rooms, the living room, the dining room, the study. My search grew more frantic. I pulled cushions off sofas, ran my hands under dusty furniture, peered into cold, empty fireplaces. The house remained silent, impassive, offering no clues. It was a silent, stone-faced accomplice to the theft. By late afternoon, my methodical search had devolved into a desperate, chaotic frenzy. I was a man possessed, fueled by grief and fury. I stormed upstairs, throwing open doors, tearing sheets off beds, emptying the contents of drawers onto the floor. I ransacked wardrobes, my father's watch, his memory, stolen from me by this place. Dust filled the air, choking me, but I didn't care. I was violating the rule with every fiber of my being. I was screaming at the house, my voice raw and hoarse. "Give it back! Do you hear me? Give it back to me!" My only reply was the echoing of my own voice, swallowed by the ancient, indifferent wood. As dusk began to fall, I finally collapsed, exhausted and defeated, in the middle of the ransacked master bedroom. The watch was gone, the sunset casting long, distorted shadows across the mess I had made. The rule I had so defiantly broken had won. I had sought it out, and I had failed. And now, as the last light vanished from the mountain peak, I remembered the other rule, the one I'd broken the night before. A new, colder fear began to seep into my bones. I had not just broken a rule, I had spent the entire day defying it, screaming at whatever was listening, and now night was here. I retreated to my room, not even bothering to barricade the door this time. What was the point? I was too drained to care. I fell onto the bed, and into a state that was neither sleep nor wakefulness, a feverish, anxious twilight. And that's when the new sound started. It wasn't a dragging chain, it was a tick. A quiet, rhythmic tick-tock, the sound of a watch. I sat bolt upright, my blood turning to ice. Tick-tock, tick-tock. It was close, incredibly close. I fumbled for my flashlight, its beam cutting a frantic path across the room. There was nothing there. But the sound persisted, steady and implacable. Tick-tock, tick-tock. I pressed my ear to the wall, then the floor. It wasn't coming from the structure of the house. I put my hands over my ears, pressing hard enough to hurt, but it made no difference. The sound wasn't coming from outside. It was inside my head. It was a clear, precise, mechanical ticking, resonating directly against my skull, as if the watch was somehow embedded in my own mind. Tick-tock, tick-tock. Panic, pure and undiluted, seized me. I scrambled out of bed, pacing the room like a caged animal, the sound a constant, maddening companion. It was a form of torture, an insidious, psychological assault. It never wavered in its tempo, a perfect 60 beats per minute rhythm that was slowly, methodically driving me insane. All night it continued. Through the long, dark hours, the only thing in my universe was that sound, a phantom heartbeat counting down to something. I wept. I begged the silent room for it to stop, but it did not. Just before dawn, as my mind was fraying to the point of breaking, it simply ceased. The sudden, absolute silence was as shocking as the sound itself. I lay there, trembling in the pre-dawn chill, the phantom echo of the ticking still pulsating in my brain. I had not slept. I'm not sure I would ever truly sleep again. When the sun finally rose, I stumbled out of the room, a hollowed-out shell of the man I had been the day before. I walked down the stairs, my movements slow and robotic. I entered the main hall and I stopped. There, on the small round mahogany table, was my father's watch, or rather, what was left of it. It had been completely and perfectly disassembled. Every single component, the case, the crystal face, the hands, the crown, every minuscule screw, every delicate gear, every tiny spring, was laid out on the dark wood of the table. They were not in a pile. They were arranged in a perfect, breathtakingly precise spiral, starting with the outer case and spiraling inward to the smallest, almost microscopic cog at the very center. It was a work of impossible, malevolent art, a meticulous deconstruction performed by a being that possessed not just immense power, but a terrifying, intimate understanding of mechanics. It was a message, clearer than any written word. I know how this works. I know how to take it apart, and I can do the same to you. I stood there for a long time just staring. The anger was gone. The defiance was gone. All that remained was a vast, empty chasm of horror. I had tested the rules, and the rules had tested me back and found me wanting. As I finally tore my gaze away from the dismantled heart of my father's memory, I looked out the window. A thick, white, unnatural fog was rolling down from the mountains. It wasn't drifting or blowing. It was descending. A silent, deliberate tide of grey, swallowing the trees, the path, the entire world. Within minutes, the house was completely enveloped, an isolated island in a featureless white sea. The visibility dropped to zero. The road was gone, the forest was gone, escape was gone. I was trapped. Not just by a house, but by a power that had just shown me in no uncertain terms that it was now in complete control. The fog did not lift. Days bled into one another, each dawn revealing the same impenetrable pearlescent wall of white that encased the property. It was a shroud, a sensory deprivation chamber on a vast scale, erasing the world beyond the immediate perimeter of the house and the few skeletal trees that loomed near it. The sun became a diffuse cataract-like glow in the sky, providing a cold, shadowless light, but no warmth. My concept of time began to warp, measured not by the sun's arc, but by a dreary cycle of grey day and black, silent night. I was a castaway on an island of rotting timber, adrift in a sea of absolute white. My routine, once driven by the ambitious purpose of restoration, had withered into a grim regimen of survival. I no longer saw the house as a project. I saw it as my keeper, my cage. I rationed the food I had brought, the flavors of granola bars and canned soup turning to ash in my mouth. I moved through the rooms with a quiet, shuffling gait, a prisoner learning the boundaries of his cell. My defiance was gone, scoured from me by the phantom ticking and the exquisitely cruel disassembly of my father's watch. In its place was a brittle, hyper-vigilant compliance. I adhered to the first rule with a zealot's devotion, retreating to my room long before the last ambient light faded, my ears straining against the profound silence of the evenings. I checked the north-facing attic window every morning, ensuring its slight opening was perfectly maintained. I avoided the family's old tools and left my modern equipment untouched, gathering dust. I was behaving. I was trying to be a good prisoner. For several days the house was quiet, deceptively so. The silence was a new kind of torture, a coiled spring of anticipation. My mind, starved of external stimuli, began to turn on itself. I would hear faint whispers in the sigh of the wind, see fleeting shapes in the motes of dust dancing in the pale light. Was this the house? Or was this the beginning of my own unraveling? I started talking to myself, narrating my actions in a low murmur, just to hear a human voice, to anchor myself to the rapidly eroding shoreline of my sanity. Okay, Ethan. Time to boil some water. Find the pot. Good. Now the stove. Each simple action became a monumental effort of will. My architectural work was a distant memory, a life that belonged to someone else. Now my entire focus was on observing, on listening, on trying to understand the terrible, unseen intelligence with which I shared this space. It was not a ghost. Ghosts were echoes of the dead, trapped in loops of memory. This was something else entirely. It was active, it was aware, and as I would soon learn with devastating clarity, it was a scholar of the human psyche. The melody began on the 5th day of the fog. It did not start abruptly. It emerged, seeping into the consciousness of the house so subtly that at first I wasn't sure I was hearing it at all. It was a faint resonance, a high, thin series of notes woven into the groaning of the floorboards above, the whisper of the draft under the door. I froze mid-step in the hallway, my head cocked, every nerve ending alight. There it was again, a simple descending arpeggio. It was a tune I knew, a tune buried so deep in the bedrock of my memory that hearing it here in this place felt like a physical violation. It was the lullaby my mother used to hum to me when I had a fever as a child. A simple, nameless melody she had composed herself, a private piece of music shared only between the two of us. She had been gone for over a decade, and I hadn't consciously thought of that tune in years. Yet here it was, leaking from the very walls of my prison, a perfect, note-for-note recreation. A sob of pure, unadulterated horror caught in my throat. This was a new level of intrusion. The watch had been an attack on my sentiment, on my connection to my father. This was an attack on my memory itself. It was an excavation of my most private, vulnerable self. The third rule slammed into the forefront of my mind, a flashing neon sign in the darkness of my panic. If a melody is heard from within the walls, accompany it with a low whistle. Never attempt to find its source. For a terrifying moment, I was paralyzed by indecision. To whistle along felt like participation, like engaging in a conversation with the monster. It felt like surrender. But the alternative, to defy the rule, was unthinkable. The image of my father's watch, meticulously dismembered, flashed behind my eyes. What would be the punishment for this transgression? The deconstruction of a memory, the unmaking of a piece of my own mind. My lips were dry, my breath coming in ragged, shallow gasps. I forced them into a pucker. The first sound that emerged was a pathetic, airy hiss. I tried again. A thin, quavering note emerged. I whistled the first few notes of the lullaby, my sound a fragile, terrified counterpoint to the clear, pure tones emanating from the walls. And then, the most terrifying thing of all happened. The melody from the walls stopped. The silence that followed was deafening. I stood rigid, my heart pounding a wild, frantic rhythm. Had I done the wrong thing, the right thing? After a few seconds that stretched into an eternity, the melody began again. But this time, it was different. It had shifted its key to perfectly harmonize with my last trembling note. It was listening. It was adapting. It was inviting me to continue. This was not a recording. This was not an echo. This was a duet. With tears streaming down my face, I continued to whistle. I followed the melody as it wove its way through the structure of the house, sometimes seeming to come from the ceiling, other times from the floorboards beneath my feet. And all the while, the entity harmonized with me. It played call and response, letting me whistle a phrase and then repeating it back to me with an added complex harmony. It was learning. It was studying music theory, emotion and memory, using my mother's lullaby as its textbook and my terror as its raw data. I was no longer just a prisoner. I was an instrument being played by an unseen, unknowable musician. I whistled until my lips were numb and my lungs burned, and only then, as the last light failed outside, did the melody finally fade away, leaving me slumped against a wall utterly spent, a hollowed-out gourd of a man. The duet broke something inside me. The line between what was real and what was a hallucination, already blurred, now seemed to dissolve completely. The entity, having established this new, terrifying intimacy, began to use its newfound knowledge of me as a weapon. The voices started the next day. They weren't loud. They were whispers, always at the very edge of my hearing, designed to make me question my own senses. I'd be opening a can of beans, and I would hear a soft feminine sigh from the corner of the room. Ethan. I'd spin around, can opener clutched in my white-knuckled fist, to find only empty, silent air. The voice belonged to Sarah, a woman I had loved, a woman I was supposed to marry. A woman I had left because my career, my ambition, had been more important. The guilt of that decision was a quiet, constant companion, a ghost I had learned to live with. Now, the house was giving that ghost a voice. It began to use phrases I remembered, twisted into new, painful contexts. I was trying to read one of the old books by the dim light of the window when I heard her voice, clear as if she were standing right behind me, whisper, "Is this what you wanted? All this quiet?" It was a direct quote from our last terrible fight, a question I had never been able to answer. I threw the book across the room, my scream of, "Leave me alone," absorbed by the thick, thirsty silence. The true masterstroke of its cruelty, however, came a few nights later. It began to use my father's voice, not the voice from my memories, the warm, encouraging tone of a proud father. This was a different voice, one I had only heard a few times in my life, when I had truly, deeply disappointed him. It was a voice of quiet, profound sorrow. I was lying on my bed, staring into the oppressive darkness, when it came from the foot of the bed. "I thought you were stronger than this, son." The words were a physical blow. They bypassed my ears and struck me squarely in the chest. It was his voice, his exact cadence, his particular way of sighing just before he spoke. "Letting this place break you. You're not building anything here. You're just falling apart." I curled into a fetal position, pulling the musty blanket over my head, a pathetic, childish defense against a voice that was already inside me. It knew my deepest fear, not of ghosts or monsters, but of failure, of not living up to the expectations of the man whose dismantled watch now lay in a sad plastic bag on my bedside table. I tried to fight back. I took out my digital audio recorder, my last bastion of objective technological truth. I would capture the voices. I would prove to myself that I wasn't going insane. I left it running all day in the main hall. That evening, I rewound the recording, my hands trembling as I pressed the play button. All it had captured was static, hours and hours of a low, hissing hum. But as I listened, my blood ran cold. The static wasn't random. Within its white noise, there was a pattern, a slow, rhythmic pulse, and underneath it, almost too low to perceive, was a faint, distorted melody. It was the lullaby. The device hadn't captured the voices, but it had captured the carrier wave. It had recorded the presence of the entity itself, a sound my own ears couldn't perceive. I was not going crazy. The truth was infinitely worse. I was the only one who could hear the targeted transmissions. The phenomenon was tuning itself specifically to my mind. My world had shrunk to the four walls of my bedroom. I stopped venturing into the rest of the house unless absolutely necessary. I was losing weight, my clothes hanging loosely on my gaunt frame. My face in the grimy bathroom mirror was a mask of terror. Wide, haunted eyes, a pale, unshaven jaw, the face of a stranger on the brink of collapse. I was no longer an architect investigating a strange property. I was a specimen under a microscope, being prodded and dissected by an alien intelligence that was using the architecture of my own soul, the memories that made me me, as its personal playbook. It was learning what it meant to be human by systematically, carefully, and painlessly taking a human being apart, piece by emotional piece. The goal was no longer to escape the house. The goal was now to simply survive the next broadcast, the next memory played back to me as a weapon, a goal that felt more impossible with each passing hour. The psychological siege was relentless. My existence had been compressed into the four walls of a single bedroom, a crumbling fortress against an enemy that lived inside my own head. The whispers continued, insidious and clever, using the voices of my loved ones to pry at the cracks in my sanity. The lullaby would return at random, a faint ethereal melody that sent shivers of violation through me. I was starving, not just for food, but for reason, for a single, solid piece of logic in a universe that had become fluid and malevolent. My architectural plans, my blueprints for the future, lay forgotten in their tube. Now my only obsession was the blueprint of my own terror. It was in this state of abject desperation, huddled on the floor during a particularly vicious bout of auditory torment, my father's voice, thick with disappointment, seeming to emanate from the very pillow I clutched, that a new thought pierced through the fog of my fear. It was not a thought of escape, for the impenetrable white wall outside had erased that possibility. It was a thought of understanding. If I was to be destroyed, I needed to know why. If my mind was to be unmade, I wanted to see the schematics of my own destruction. My only artifact, my only clue in this entire nightmare was the leather-bound notebook. The rules. With a surge of desperate energy, I scrambled to my makeshift desk. I had photographed every page, but I needed the object itself. I retrieved it from my pack, the worn leather cool and strangely comforting in my trembling hands. I didn't just reread the rules this time. I studied them. I dissected them. I searched for a meta-language hidden within the spidery script. I analyzed the ink, the pressure of the pen, the spacing between the words, searching for a cipher, a hidden meaning. And then I saw it. It was not in the rules themselves, but in the margins. On the page detailing rule number 2, about the attic window, there was a faint, almost invisible annotation in graphite, much lighter than the ink of the rules. It looked like a child's doodle at first, but as I angled it under the weak, diffused daylight, I recognized it. It was a crude, schematic drawing of a fireplace, with a single stone on the mantelpiece marked with a tiny, almost imperceptible X. Below it were 3 words, so faded I could barely decipher them. Where heat fails, the main fireplace, the grand stone behemoth in the living room, its hearth cold and black for what must have been decades, where heat fails. It wasn't a riddle, it was a statement of fact. A place that was meant to be warm but was now eternally cold. A new purpose, sharp and clear, cut through my despair. This was a breadcrumb, a deliberate clue. Getting to the living room meant leaving the relative safety of my room, crossing the open no-man's land of the upper hallway and the grand staircase. But the need for an answer now outweighed the terror of the journey. Clutching the notebook, I took a deep breath and opened my door. The house was silent. Not the empty silence of a vacant building, but the watchful, expectant stillness of a predator. I moved as quietly as I could, my socked feet making no sound on the dusty floorboards. Every creak of the house was a held breath, every shadow a potential shape. The whispers stayed mercifully quiet, as if the house itself were curious to see what I would do. I reached the massive fireplace. It dominated the room, a monument of river stones and dark, soot-stained mortar reaching all the way to the high ceiling. The mantelpiece was a single, thick slab of hewn oak. I ran my hands over its surface, feeling the grain of the old wood. Nothing. I then turned my attention to the stonework above it, my eyes scanning for any irregularity. I saw it almost immediately. One of the stones, a flat grey piece of slate to the left of the center, had a tiny dark mark on it that could, if one were looking for it, be interpreted as a small, chiseled X. My heart hammered in my chest. I pushed at the stone. It didn't budge. I tried to find a purchase for my fingers in the mortar around it, but it was solid as the mountain itself. For a frantic moment I thought I was wrong, that I was just seeing patterns in the stone, my mind projecting hope where there was none. Then I remembered the rest of the clue, where heat fails. I thought of the flue, the chimney, the inner workings. I knelt and peered into the cavernous black hearth, the air within smelling of ancient smoke and something else, something acrid and metallic. Running my hands along the inner wall of the fireplace, my fingers, coated in soot, brushed against something that wasn't stone. A small iron lever, cleverly camouflaged against the dark interior. I pulled it. There was a deep, grinding sound from within the masonry, the sound of stone grating against stone. I looked up, and the stone marked with the X had receded by half an inch, creating a new shadow line. My fingers, trembling with a mixture of fear and elation, found the edge and pulled. The stone pivoted inwards, revealing a dark rectangular cavity. It was a hidden compartment, and it was not empty. Reaching into the cold, dark space, my hand closed around a bundle of oilcloth-wrapped objects. I drew them out into the pale light. There were several of them, all journals of varying sizes and ages. One was a thick, heavy ledger, its leather cover cracked and flaking. Another was a small, simple diary bound in cloth. And the last one was a modern, spiral-bound notebook, its pages filled with a cramped, agitated scrawl. This was it. This was the history. This was the answer. I took the chronicles of my family's vigil back to my room, barricaded the door, and with a single lamp casting a small golden circle of light in the oppressive gloom, I began to read. I started with the oldest, the heavy ledger, its first entry dated 1788. The handwriting was an elegant, almost calligraphic script, and the language was archaic, filled with the fire and brimstone piety of the era. The writer was my ancestor, Hezekiah Cole, the man who built this house. October 12th, 1788, it began. The foundation is laid upon the cursed ground. God forgive me for what I build here. Not a home for my family, but a cage for the calamity that sleeps beneath the stone. The folk of the valleys speak of it in hushed tones, a spirit of the mountain. But I have listened at the fissures in the rock, and what I hear is no spirit. It is a deep and terrible thought, dreaming in the heart of the world. We are not its masters, we are its keepers. We build this anchor of wood and iron to hold its attention, to keep its sleeping gaze fixed here, lest it wake and turn its eye upon the wider world of men. I read on, my blood turning to ice. Hezekiah wrote of the entity not as a creature, but as a condition, a fundamental wrongness in the fabric of reality that was deepest in this specific valley. The house was not a home, it was a precisely engineered anchor designed to placate and contain this presence. The rules, he explained, were not superstitions but the articles of a grim covenant. The open window to let the thin air circulate, the prohibition of foreign metals to avoid disharmonious resonance, the melodies from the walls, which he called the sleeper's dream song, and the need to whistle along to affirm the keeper's presence. The disappearing objects were tithes, small sacrifices of personal energy and meaning to keep the entity sated. My family were not owners. They were wardens of an unnameable, unthinkable cosmic prisoner. Next, I opened the cloth-bound diary, its entries dating from the late 1800s. The writer was a woman, Elspeth Cole, a schoolteacher and amateur naturalist. Her perspective was less religious, but infinitely more terrifying. She approached the phenomenon with a scientific, albeit horrified, curiosity. May 3, 1892, she wrote, "I have come to believe Father's calamity is not a spirit, but a principle, a form of sentient geometry that imposes its alien logic upon our own. This valley is not haunted. It is a place where the foundational laws of our physics become porous. The house acts as a lens, or perhaps a Faraday cage, focusing the phenomenon and grounding its influence. I used a galvanometer near the northern wall tonight during one of its melodic phases. The needle oscillated in a clear, repeating pattern, a perfect representation of the tune. The entity does not make sound. It vibrates the very substrate of reality, and our senses interpret this vibration as music. It learns. My God, how it learns. It has begun to mimic the songs of the birds from outside the fog. It is testing its influence, expanding its vocabulary. Elspeth's journal was filled with chillingly precise observations. She chronicled fluctuations in temperature that defied thermodynamics, documented objects levitating for brief moments, and recorded witnessing the corridor outside her room, seeming to lengthen and shorten by several feet over the course of an hour. She theorized that the payment of personal objects was a way for the entity to study the concept of emotional attachment, of value, a way to learn about the consciousness of its jailers. The horror I felt was transforming. It was no longer the simple fear of a haunted house. It was a deep, existential vertigo, the feeling of standing at the edge of an abyss and realizing that all of my knowledge, all of human science, was a child's drawing of a universe whose true architecture was monstrously, impossibly alien. Finally, with a sense of ultimate dread, I opened the most recent notebook. It was my great-great-uncle's, the man who had left me this house. His name was Arthur Cole, and his handwriting was a frantic, barely legible scrawl, full of crossed-out sentences and angry marginalia. His entries were dated but sporadic, spanning the last 30 years. His was the chronicle of a man at the end of a long and terrible watch. June 11th, 1995. It's getting stronger, or perhaps the anchor is getting weaker. The wood rots, the stones settle, the integrity of the cage is compromised. It learns faster now. Last week, it used my dead wife's voice, not a memory. It spoke new words. It asked me why I hadn't fixed the leak in the roof. It is observing the present. It is looking through my eyes. March 22nd, 2010. The fog is lasting longer each year. The barrier between its dream space and our world is thinning. I spend my days reinforcing the structure, replacing rotten beams, remortaring the foundation, following the old ways. But I am one man, and I am old. The vigil requires more than I have left to give. It needs new wood, new blood. Then I came to the final entries from just over a year ago. They were written to me, to whoever finds this, to the next of my blood. I am sorry. I have failed. The house needs more than repair. It requires renewal. I have held the line my entire life, but the decay is too deep. I have left the house to my great-grandnephew, an architect, a builder. He will not understand. He will come with his modern tools and his modern ideas. He will see rot and want to fix it. He will see history and want to preserve it. He will not know that every nail he pulls, every beam he replaces with foreign wood, every wire he runs, he is not restoring the house. He is dismantling the lock on the cell door. He will break the rules, because he will not know they are all that stand between the world and the thought that dreams beneath it. And when he does, it will turn its attention to him. It will study him. It will learn from him. It will use him. I do not know what will happen then. Perhaps he will be strong enough to take my place. Perhaps his breaking of the house will be the final act that allows the sleeper to finally awaken. I have only one final piece of advice for him. Do not fix what is broken. Just pray you can survive inside it. I dropped the notebook as if it were burning. It all crashed down on me, a tidal wave of horrifying comprehension. The power tools dying, the chain in the basement, the stolen watch, the lullaby, the voices. It wasn't random malice. It was a system responding to a threat. It was the house's immune system, and I was the infection. My restoration project wasn't an act of preservation. It was an act of profound, world-ending desecration. I had been diligently, cheerfully, and expertly unmaking the cage that held back the end of human sanity. The psychological torment was not a haunting. It was a diagnostic test, run by an ancient intelligence on the new, unknown variable that had just entered its enclosure. Me. And I had failed every single test. The truth did not set me free. The truth was a cage far smaller and far more terrifying than the house itself. I was not a victim of a ghost. I was the ignorant, bumbling fool who had just tripped the final wire on a cosmic bomb, and my own mind was now inextricably part of its detonation mechanism. The world ended, not with a bang, but with the turning of a brittle, yellowed page. For a day, perhaps two, time had become a treacherous, fluid concept. I did not move from the floor of my room. The journals lay scattered around me like the tombstones of my ancestors. My body was a statue of flesh, but my mind was a maelstrom, endlessly replaying the terrible narrative I had unearthed. Hezekiah's grim piety, Elspeth's horrified science, Arthur's exhausted despair. It was a relay race of damnation, and I, the final runner, had just tripped and fallen, shattering the baton. The guilt was a physical weight, a pressure in my chest so profound I found it difficult to breathe. Every modern screw I had driven, every new plank I had measured, every wire I had laid was an act of cosmic vandalism. My ambition, my professionalism, my confident, rational worldview, it had all been a blind man's arrogance, a child's cheerful dismantling of a nuclear bomb. The house, in its terrible way, had been right to torment me. I was not a victim. I was the fool at the gates, inviting the barbarians in. The whispers for a time fell silent. The melodies ceased. The house was holding its breath, waiting. This, I realized, was the most terrifying phase yet. The probing had stopped because the initial diagnostic was complete. The entity had assessed the new variable, this ignorant, destructive descendant, and now, having seen the extent of the damage I had wrought, it was simply observing, waiting for my next move. The silence was not a reprieve. It was the calm before the storm, the deep intake of breath before the final, world-shattering scream. My professional life had been about solving problems, identifying a structural weakness, and designing a reinforcement. I looked around the room, not at the dust and the decay, but at the errors. My errors. The new weather stripping I'd installed around the window frame, a modern polymer seal that likely interfered with the delicate exchange the open sash was meant to facilitate. The patch of modern plaster I'd used to cover a crack in the wall, an inert material where the original horsehair lime plaster probably had specific resonant properties. My restoration had been a cancer, a series of benign-looking tumors that were choking the life out of the house's true function. The paralysis of despair finally broke, replaced by a new, terrifying clarity. My goal was no longer restoration, and it was certainly not escape. My new and likely final purpose was damage control. I could not rebuild what I had broken, for I lacked the knowledge and the materials of my ancestors. But perhaps, just perhaps, I could staunch the bleeding. I could show the house, show the sleeper that dreamed beneath it, that I finally understood. That I was no longer an invader, but a penitent. My first act of compliance was small, almost pathetic in its simplicity. I remembered the loose floorboard in the upstairs hallway, one I had proudly secured with a set of sleek, corrosion-resistant deck screws, an act of structural improvement. Now I saw it for what it was, a foreign metallic intrusion, a violation of the house's sacred grammar. Armed with my drill, I carefully backed out each of the modern screws, the high-pitched whine of the tool sounding like a blasphemy in the silence. I placed them in a pile, like extracted bullets. Then I went down to the old workshop, the place where I had first found the notebook, and rummaged through a rusted coffee can until I found what I was looking for. A handful of old, hand-forged iron nails, their heads crudely squared, their shafts pitted with age. I carried them back to the hallway as if they were holy relics. Using a simple old hammer, I gently tapped the ancient nails back into the original holes in the floorboard, securing it as it had been secured for 200 years. The thud of the hammer was a dull, respectful sound, a prayer in percussion. When I finished, I ran my hand over the floorboard. It was secure, but more than that, the air in the hallway felt different. A subtle shift, like a change in barometric pressure. A persistent, nagging cold spot that had always lingered near that section of the hall seemed to have lessened, the chill receding like a retreating tide. It was a response. A subtle, almost imperceptible nod of acknowledgement from the house itself. It was the first time I had done something right, and the confirmation, as terrifying as it was, filled me with a sliver of something that felt dangerously like hope. Thus began my new life as the house's physician, its caretaker, its supplicant. My architectural surveys were abandoned. In their place, I began a new kind of mapping. I did not map dimensions or load-bearing walls. I mapped the anomalies. I charted the house's pain. My new journal was filled not with measurements but with observations. 08G, persistent temperature drop in the west parlor, localized around the window frame where the new caulking was applied. Note, remove caulking. 1430, faint rhythmic clicking from within the pantry wall, corresponds to the location where I ran new electrical wiring. Action, deactivate the circuit. 21 the static on the audio recorder has shifted from a low hum to a higher frequency pulse. This began after I moved the iron bed frame in my room. Hypothesis, large metallic objects affect the field. Action, return the bed to its original position. I stopped being an antagonist and became a component. I began to learn the language of the house, a language spoken not in words, but in the subtle violations of physical law. A creak was no longer just a creak. It was a sentence, a complaint from a stressed joint in the esoteric structure. A flicker of the lights was not a fault in the generator. It was a spike in the local energy field. I was no longer a man in a house. I was a nerve ending in a vast unknowable organism, learning to interpret its signals of distress. The entity's interactions with me began to change too. The direct psychological attacks, the voices of my past, receded, replaced by something far stranger. It was no longer trying to break me with torment. It was now testing my newfound understanding. It was presenting me with puzzles. One morning, I came out of my room to find a door in the hallway where no door had been the night before. It was a simple, plain wooden door, identical to the others, but it stood in a section of solid wall. My first reaction was a jolt of primal fear, but then the new analytical part of my mind took over. This wasn't a random manifestation. It was a question. I approached it slowly. The brass doorknob was cold, real. I turned it and opened the door. The room beyond was impossible. It was a perfect, life-sized recreation of my childhood bedroom, down to the sci-fi posters on the wall and the worn patch on the rug where I used to sit and build models. The air smelled of old paper and the specific brand of wood polish my mother used. For a heart-stopping moment, I was overwhelmed with a wave of emotion so powerful it almost brought me to my knees. But I knew it was a fabrication, a complex illusion woven from my own memories. I forced myself to be an observer. I stepped inside, my eyes scanning for the purpose of this display. Everything was perfect, except for one detail. On the bedside table, next to a model spaceship I had treasured, sat a single, perfect, red apple, so vibrant and glossy it looked unreal. I had never had an apple in my room. I was, in fact, mildly allergic to them as a child. What was this? A mistake in the memory matrix? Or was it the point? I stood there for a long time, the silence of the impossible room pressing in on me. The apple. It was an offering, a symbol, knowledge, a choice. Was it a trap, inviting me to partake in its poisoned reality? Or was it a communication, an attempt to use a symbol I would understand? I thought of Elspeth's journals, her theory that the entity learned through observation and interaction. I backed out of the room, slowly and gently closed the door. I did not accept the offering. I did not engage with the false reality. The next morning, the door was gone. The wall was solid once more. I felt a sense of calm from the house, a quiet approval. I had passed the test. I had demonstrated that I could distinguish between its manipulations and the baseline reality of the vigil. But as my attunement to the house deepened, the very fabric of that baseline reality began to fray at the edges. The laws of physics, which Elspeth had described as porous here, were becoming increasingly unreliable. Time and space were no longer the rigid, dependable constants of my former life. They were becoming suggestions. I would walk down the main hallway, heading for the kitchen, only to find myself inexplicably emerging from the door of the upstairs linen closet, with no memory of having climbed the stairs. I lost hours at a time, looking at my watch to see it was noon, then blinking to find the deep twilight of evening outside the window. One terrifying afternoon, I watched the hands on my watch spin backward for a full minute, the unsettling motion accompanied by the faint, reversed sound of birdsong from the fog-shrouded outdoors. The geometry of the house itself began to shift in subtle, nauseating ways. I would look down a corridor and have the distinct, vertiginous feeling that it was stretching, the far end receding from me as I walked. Corners in rooms would sometimes appear to be not quite 90 degrees, an obtuse, unsettling angle that made my architect's brain ache. The house was not a static structure. It was a living, breathing, four-dimensional equation, and my clumsy repairs had unbalanced it, causing it to solve for increasingly irrational variables. The climax of this new phase arrived without warning. I was in the cellar, checking the ancient stone foundations as I now did daily, when I noticed a web of fine, dark cracks spreading from a cornerstone. This was new, but more than the physical damage, I could feel it. A profound wrongness emanated from the spot, a vibration that resonated deep in my bones, making my teeth ache. The air around the cornerstone was visibly distorted, shimmering like heat haze on a summer road, and a low, discordant hum, like 1,000 out-of-tune cellos, filled the space. The fabric of the anchor was tearing. Frantically, I searched the journals, my hands shaking so badly I could barely turn the pages. I found a passage in Hezekiah's ledger, a section on emergency repairs. His script was dense, almost indecipherable, but I managed to piece it together. Should the foundation fissure and the sleeper's dream song turn to a groan, the earth wound must be packed with the salt of the deep stone and the keeper's own blood to remind the calamity of its covenant with both earth and man. The salt of the deep stone. Rule number 4 from the original prompt idea, a rule I'd seen in the first notebook but now understood from another of Hezekiah's passages. Bring no salt from the world of men, for its taste is foreign. Use only the salt from the deep cellar lode, for it remembers the age of the stone. I found it in a stone crock in the darkest corner of the cellar, coarse, grayish salt crystals that felt strangely cold to the touch. The keeper's own blood. That was the other component. With a shard of broken glass from a discarded jar, I made a cut on my own hand, a sharp, searing pain that was shockingly, groundingly real. I let my blood drip into the crock of salt, mixing the red and the gray into a grim, damp paste. The humming intensified, the air growing colder, but I forced myself forward. I began packing the mixture into the cracks in the foundation, my fingers raw and stinging, my blood and the ancient salt a mortar of flesh and mineral. As I packed the last of the grim paste into the fissures, the discordant humming abruptly stopped. The shimmering in the air vanished. A profound silence descended on the cellar, and with it a feeling I could only describe as relief. Not my relief. The house's. I slumped back against the opposite wall, breathing heavily, my bleeding hand throbbing in time with my own pulse. I had done it. I had patched a hole in the skin of reality. But as I sat there in the cold, damp dark, a new and final horror dawned on me. As the house's sense of relief had washed over me, I had felt the connection. I had felt the tension in the cornerstone ease, as if it were a muscle in my own back. I felt the subtle realignment of the floorboards above, as if they were my own bones settling. My panicked, desperate attempts to attune myself to the house had worked too well. I was no longer just its caretaker. The ritual of blood and salt had been more than a repair. It had been an initiation. My blood was now literally in the foundation. I had become a part of the mechanism, a living, breathing, feeling component of the cage. The distinction between where Ethan ended and the house began was now and forever terrifyingly unclear. A final log entry. My last, I think. The journals speak of a final protocol, a last resort when the integrity of the structure is irrevocably compromised. They call it the realignment, a ritual that must be performed when the anchor weakens past a certain threshold. I believe that threshold has been reached. My clumsy repairs were stitches on a wound that required amputation. The humming from the foundation has returned, deeper now, a resonant thrum that I feel in my teeth, in my bones, in the very marrow of my being. I broke the rules, and now I must enforce the oldest one of all. If you have any theories about what happens when a warden fails and a new one is consecrated, write them in the comments below. I need to read another human voice just one last time before my own falls silent for good. My new existence was a strange and fragile equilibrium. The boundaries of my physical self, once so clearly defined, had become porous, indistinct. My awareness, no longer confined to the bony cage of my skull, had bled outwards, seeping into the lath and plaster, flowing through the ancient timbers like sap. I would stand in the kitchen and feel a draft from the attic window, not on my skin, but as a distant internal shiver. I could sense the slow, inexorable decay in the floor joists of the west wing, as a dull ache, like phantom limb pain, for a body I had never consciously possessed. The house had a metabolism, a slow, deep geologic pulse, and my own heartbeat was beginning to synchronize with it. The direct personal torments had ceased entirely. The entity, the sleeper, no longer needed to probe my memories. I was now part of the sensory apparatus of its confinement. It was no longer a matter of it studying me. We were now in a state of horrific, intimate cohabitation. It dreamed its impossible, geometric dreams in the earth below, and I, in the structure above, had become the nerve-jangled, sentient skin of its cell. My days were spent not in fear, but in a state of constant low-grade vigilance. I was no longer a prisoner, but a component with a function. I maintained the strange ecosystem of the house with the grim devotion of a monk. I cleared a fallen branch from a gutter, not because it would cause water damage, but because I could feel the improper weight distribution, the subtle dissonant pressure it exerted on the eaves. I replaced a cracked window pane with a piece of salvaged centuries-old glass from the workshop, not for aesthetics, but because the clear, perfect molecular structure of modern glass created a hole in the house's atmospheric shield, letting in a thin, piercing note of the wrong kind of reality. I ate, I drank, I slept, but these actions felt like secondary mechanical processes required to maintain the biological component of the system, me. The true work was this constant, silent communion with the structure. I learned that the house was not just wood and stone. It was a complex lattice of esoteric energies, of focused intent and ritualistic reinforcement. The original builders, my ancestors, had been more than carpenters. They had been masters of a kind of architectural metaphysics that bordered on magic. Every joint, every beam, every nail was placed not just for structural support, but for its resonant properties, its role in the grand harmonic equation of containment, an equation I had nearly erased through my ignorant competence. But the peace, if such a grim state could be called that, was not to last. My repairs had been those of a first aid medic, not a surgeon. I had applied bandages and sutures to a body riddled with a terminal illness. The fundamental damage I had inflicted in my first weeks, with my foreign metals and modern materials, had been too profound. The anchor was failing. It began with the humming from the cellar. The low, resonant thrum I had quelled with blood and salt returned, but it was different now. It was deeper, more complex, filled with discordant overtones that grated on my expanded senses. It was the sound of a vast machine waking from a long slumber, its immense gears grinding against one another. Then the physical reality of the house began to degrade at an accelerated rate. The subtle, unsettling shifts in geometry became gross, undeniable impossibilities. I would walk towards the grand staircase, only to watch it flatten into a smooth, featureless ramp before my eyes, the image wavering like a heat haze before snapping back into its proper form. The patterns on the wallpaper in the upstairs hallway began to slowly, sinuously writhe, the floral designs curling and uncurling like sleeping sea anemones. One evening, looking out the south-facing window, I saw not the familiar fog-shrouded tree line, but a landscape of impossible crystalline spires under a sky of bruised purple, a vista that lasted for a full, terrifying minute before the fog washed back over it. The sleeper was dreaming more powerfully, and its dreams were beginning to overwrite the world. The house was fighting back, groaning and straining under the pressure, but it was a losing battle. The structure I was now a part of was dying. I could feel it. A network of hairline cracks was spreading through the foundation, not just a physical fracturing, but a tearing in the metaphysical fabric of the place. The containment field was failing. With a final desperate surge of the man I used to be, I went back to the journals. I needed the final answer. I tore through Hezekiah's pious warnings and Elspeth's clinical horror until I reached Arthur's last, frantic entries. I had read his final letter to me, but I now saw there were pages after it, pages I had overlooked in my initial shock, filled with a script that was almost a primal scream. He wrote of the realignment, but with a new, terrible context. "It is not a repair," he had scrawled, the graphite tearing the page. "The renewal is not of the house, it is of the warden. The structure is merely the vessel, the chassis. It is the conscious mind within it that provides the true lock, the active, sentient counter-frequency to the sleeper's dream song. When the vessel is too damaged, a new consciousness must be installed, fused. It must willfully entwine itself with the esoteric framework, becoming the new soul of the cage. It is not a ritual one performs with salt and blood. It is a choice one makes to abandon the self and become the architecture of the vigil." I finally understood. The blood ritual had not been the final step. It had been the key turning in the lock, preparing the mechanism. Now, to save everything, I had to open the door, step through, and become the door itself. The house could no longer contain the entity on its own. It needed a new, willing human mind to process the immense data, to actively fight back, to perpetually reinforce the crumbling walls of reality from the inside. Arthur hadn't died of old age. He had held out until his consciousness was too frayed, too exhausted to serve its function. And then the structure had finally failed. He hadn't found a replacement. This was the final, terrible inheritance of the Cole family. Not the land, not the house, but the duty of this living sacrifice. I made my decision. There was, in truth, no decision to be made. To refuse was to allow the sleeper to wake, to turn its dreaming, reality-bending gaze upon a world utterly unprepared for it. My life was already forfeit. All I had left to choose was the nature of my own oblivion. I walked down to the cellar, to the cornerstone I had patched with my own blood. The air here was thick and electric, the humming so intense it felt like a solid wall of sound. The shimmering distortion around the foundation was back, more violent now, and through it I could see glimpses of that other place, the world of crystalline spires and purple skies. The cellar was no longer entirely in our world. It was a beachhead, an invasion front. I placed my hand, my scarred hand, upon the cold, vibrating stone. I closed my eyes. I did not recite an incantation or perform a ritual. I simply let go. I released the anchor of my own identity, the fierce, terrified grip I held on the concept of Ethan Cole. I opened the floodgates of my consciousness and willed it to flow outwards, into the stone, into the mortar, into the very blueprint of the house. The sensation was not one of death, but of infinite, agonizing expansion. First, my physical form dissolved. I felt my atoms unknitting, my sense of self expanding beyond the confines of my skin. My consciousness rushed into the cold, damp stone of the foundation, and for a timeless moment, I felt the immense, crushing weight of the entire structure above me. I felt the slow, patient press of the earth around me. Then my senses shattered and reformed. My sight was no longer limited to my eyes. I was looking out of every window at once. I saw the impenetrable wall of fog to the north and the impossible alien vista to the south simultaneously. My hearing became the resonance of the entire building. I could hear the scuttling of a spider in the attic, the groaning of a floorboard on the second floor, and the deep, world-ending hum of the sleeper below, all as a single, overwhelming chord. Time collapsed. I was Hezekiah, laying the cornerstone with a prayer on my lips, my hands raw from the stone. I was Elspeth, watching the corridor lengthen, my scientific mind reeling in horror. I was Arthur, old and tired, feeling the final threads of his own consciousness fray and snap. I was a future storm, lashing rain against my own roof. I saw my own arrival, a foolish, arrogant man in a truck, a ghost from a past that was happening right now. The name Ethan became a faint, distant echo, a word from a language I no longer spoke. The panicked, desperate man was a vessel I had once inhabited, but the vessel had been poured out, its contents now filling every crack, every joint, every empty space in the structure. The house's pain was my pain. Its purpose was my purpose. And as my consciousness fully integrated, I turned my new, vast awareness downwards. I faced the sleeper. I could not see it, for it had no form. I could not comprehend it, for it was a thought anathema to all human logic. But I could feel it, its immense dreaming mind pressing up against the foundation, and I pushed back. I used the house as my body. I flexed the ancient timbers, tightened the esoteric geometry, and focused the combined intent of every warden who had come before me into a single, silent, defiant command. Stay. Asleep. The violent humming softened. The shimmering distortions faded. The impossible vistas snapped shut, replaced by the familiar, comforting sight of the fog. The pressure receded. The crisis had passed. The anchor was holding once more, its failing systems now powered by a new living core. My name is not Ethan. Names are for things that begin and end, and my vigil is now eternal. I am the foundation and the roof beam. I am the creak on the stair and the cold spot in the hall. I am the vigilant silence, the warden at the heart of the anchor. The external world, the world of men and sun and sky, is a concept, a memory from a life I no longer possess. My reality is the slow, patient breathing of ancient wood and the ceaseless, dreaming pressure from below. The last of the evening light is now leaving the mountain peak. The work of the day is done. The attic window, north-facing, remains slightly ajar. Everything is in its proper place, all is in order, and always will be.